IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, welcome to today's episode. I'm very happy that we have Dr. Radhicka Kapoor with us today. And Dr. Radhicka Kapoor is a senior visiting fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Prior to joining ICRIER, she worked at the Planning Commission and at the International Labour Organization. Her broad areas of research interests include poverty and inequality, labour economics, and industrial performance. Over the last 5 years, she's worked extensively on the various facets of India's labour market, in particular in the areas of informal sector, the impact of technological changes in the world of work, and the measurement of employment and unemployment. She has authored several research papers, reports, and articles in leading newspapers on these subjects. She's also co-edited a book, Towards a Just, Dignified, and Secure Future of Work, Lessons from India. After graduating in economics from St. Stephen's College, she went on to do a master's in economics from Cambridge University and a PhD at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor, for joining us today. I'm Sridhar Krishna, as you know, from Takshashila Institution, and I'm working on a project to create 20 million jobs in India. What kind of policy initiatives can help us towards that goal? So you're absolutely the ideal guest on our show. And so I wanted to just start off by telling the audience, today we hope to discuss what's the state of employment in India and the challenges in making effective policy decisions in the absence of reliable data with sufficient granularity and minimal lag. I see that as sort of the overarching theme of today's discussion. The idea also, but at the same time, it would be important to sort of highlight what it is, right? So India experienced a job growth of 3% in the 70s. When we look back and we say our economy grew only at 3.5% per annum. But over the last 3 decades, our economy has grown at a much faster pace. India does feel like a richer country than it was at that time. And yet our job growth has been close to only 1% per annum in the last so many years. So this employment elasticity has been sort of, which was close to unity clearly in the 70s, came down to about 0.4 in the 90s, and today is less than 0.1. So with 18 million people in India turning 18 every year, we need lots of jobs in India. And we also have a large number of people who seem to be surplus in agriculture, with our agricultural productivity being so low. So you have written recently that India's employment statistics have been in the midst of a massive overhaul. The two significant changes have been the replacement of the NSSO's quinquennial employment and unemployment surveys with an annual periodic labor force survey, the PLFS, and the introduction of monthly payroll data. Given the dualistic nature of India's labor markets, the dominance of low wage and low productivity, and the problem of underemployment, this exercise will serve little purpose. This is what you had written. And I thought this would be a good place for you to sort of explain that to all of us in terms of what you mean and why do you think this is inadequate.
Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm glad that you're starting the discussion with the question of employment data because, the rest of the debate, to understand the rest of the debate, it's important to understand statistics on which all this analysis is based. So let me go back a bit in time and explain the employment data architecture that India has had. Now, predominantly, we have collected employment data from household surveys, and these have been done by the NSSO since 72-73. And these are very, very comprehensive surveys where data is collected from households. They're very important because the data is collected from households, they cover both the organized and the unorganized sector. And given that bulk of the employment in India is in the unorganized sector, it is these household surveys which actually give us, they cover the entire universe which is out there and give us a comprehensive picture of what's happening in the labor market. The issue with these, however, has been that since 72, 73, these surveys have typically been conducted quinquennially, as you said. So we essentially end up having data on key labor market indicators only once in 4 to 5 years. In 2017-18, this quinquennial survey was replaced by what is called the periodic labor force survey, which is an annual exercise, and which in all of my writings I've said is a very positive development, because one of the key challenges was that we weren't getting, data at high enough frequency. And of course, part of that reason is that India is a very large country. You're trying to cover both the organized and the unorganized sector. The questionnaires were all filled by hand. So it was very difficult to actually get this data out quickly, do these surveys more frequently. So the periodic labor force survey is a very welcome addition because it gives us annual data. Data is also collected through tablets now. It comes not just at a higher frequency, but there's also less of a delay in which the data comes out. But still, we don't get it in a timely enough fashion. That is still the trouble with the PLFS data, because, at this point, the last annual round we have is the 2019-20 round. So we've been in a bit of a vacuum for the last 2 years. What's also important to mention is that the PLFS has a quarterly module, which basically provides us with employment data from urban areas. And that, again, is a very positive development. But I would say that exercise should also be extended to rural areas, because looking just at high frequency data from quarterly from urban areas is not good enough. We need to get an understanding of what's happening in the rural areas as well. Now, though I welcome the introduction of the PLFS, I should also mention that the questionnaire of the PLFS is significantly shorter than that of the NSS quinquennial round, and obviously so because you have to do the survey each year. And what I have written about in my writings in a paper that I have on employment data strategy is that given that the NSS original questionnaire had some very key questions, especially on participation of women in the labor force, it is important that the NSO goes back to conducting the NSS quinquennial round concomitantly with the PLFS, which is held annually, with a shorter questionnaire. To the larger question of whether this is adequate or not, the point is that looking simply at unemployment rates alone is inadequate in the Indian context, because most people cannot, in fact, afford to remain unemployed. We don't have unemployment allowances. We don't have adequate safety nets. So most people will basically get by doing any kind of odd work they can find. They will either engage in self-employment or in casual work. So you will typically see low unemployment rates. And that's what we have seen in all the NSS surveys till 2011-12. The open unemployment rate was just that of 2 to 3%. The real problem is in the underemployment that is there in the economy. Mm-hmm. And that's what we don't analyze enough when we look at the PLFS data. So my problem has more been with the way we've chosen to interpret these statistics and focus, we shouldn't focus alone on the unemployment rate, especially the unemployment rate which comes from the usual status measure. Because what the usual status measure does is it asks people what their activity status was over a period of year, which is a very long reference period. So all the underemployed people also get captured as employed, and consequently you have a low unemployment rate. We should also look at what the current daily status is, which captures people's activity on a daily basis, the current weekly status, which captures it on a weekly basis. So all these metrics give you a much better idea of the extent of underemployment and the true labor underutilization in the economy. So there are various ways in which we can interpret the PLFS data more meaningfully to improve the quality of the discourse that we have on labor market in India. And on the employment data side, I should also mention that the other very important source of data is what comes from the enterprise side. India has an annual survey of industries, survey which happens every year, which collects data from the organized manufacturing sector, the industrial sector. And that's, again, an excellent survey, very, very comprehensive, very detailed. But here, too, the data comes out with a lag of 2 to 3 years. So to that extent, the real trouble with the data has been that it doesn't come out in a timely enough fashion that it can actually influence policy in real time. And of course, the metrics that we choose to look at to inform our policy need to change.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor. I think one thing that I heard from what you said was very few people in India can really afford to be unemployed, right? I mean, in order to be unemployed, you need to be relatively well off, relatively educated, to have been able to get jobs which allow you to create a little surplus, which allows you to wait till you get the kind of job that you're looking for. Most people in India have very low levels of skill and low levels of education, consequently, very low savings, and therefore go back to work irrespective of what kind of work they get. But should that also not reflect in a higher labor force participation rate in India? In India, the labor force participation rate is so low. How do you sort of, can you help me understand this whole concept of we have low unemployment rates, but also we have very low labor force participation, less than 50%, some say even closer to 42% or so.
So before I get to the labor force participation rate, let me first say a little bit more about the unemployment rate. Because even with the unemployment rate, this aggregate number that we look at, which was in the range of 2 to 3% in 2011-12. And then for the first time, we saw this number going upwards of 6% in the 17-18 PLFS. You see, that also actually conceals a lot of disaggregated trends. Because here too, if you break up the numbers, what you find is that in the youth, even with that 6% unemployment rate by usual status, the youth unemployment rate is about 17%. If you break down that unemployment rate by education level, then you find that those who are highly educated have a much higher unemployment rate. And those who have low levels of education have a much lower unemployment rate, because those are the people who can't afford to remain unemployed. Whereas, the more educated and the more well-off, they can afford to wait in the labor market and till they actually find a job that they feel is commensurate with their educational qualifications, that they feel pays them well enough. So there is a lot of disaggregation which needs to be done, even with the unemployment rate, to truly understand what it's telling you. Because if you do that, you realize that there is a serious problem. At the lower end of the labor market, the problem is of severe underemployment. And at the upper end of the market, there is a high open unemployment rate. In fact, the educated youth have had unemployment rates upwards of 20%. By educated, people who have postgraduate degrees and above. And that's simply because, these are the people who are still recording themselves as being in the labor force. They're still looking for employment. And so that statistic shows up like that. Now, the same is the issue with the labor force participation rate. When you look at this aggregate number of which has been around 50% in the last few rounds in the PLFS, here too, if you break it down and see, it's men who will have a very high labor force participation rate, about 80%. It's the women which have a significantly lower female labor force participation rate, and that's been, about 25%. CMI data says that it's even lower than that because they have a different way of measuring it. And of course, the low female labor force participation rate is a result of various factors, both on the supply and the demand side. But these metrics cannot be looked just in an aggregate sense. We need to disaggregate them, look at them by gender, by your income levels, by education levels, to actually understand what they are saying. And so, the point that I was also making in the previous question that you asked me is that I think how we choose to interpret and analyze these statistics is what is very important.
Yeah, I think because when I started working on this project to create 20 million jobs in India, the first thing that we said was, okay, do I know how many people need jobs? Do we need like 4 million jobs in India? Do we need 10 million jobs in India? Do we need 20? Then we looked at the labor force participation rate, and I tried to understand that. And I said, okay, we have 400 million people who are probably, give or take, 430, 450 million people who are probably in the workforce, but they have a much larger population, and we have a fairly young population, which means many more people than that ought to be at work. When you look at, so some of the ideas were around what do we do to improve women's labor force participation rate. I mean, I understand that, pre-pandemic or pre-Taliban coming into Afghanistan, even Afghanistan's women's labor force participation rate was slightly higher than that of India. So that sort of thing, those kind of numbers make you sort of wonder what's really wrong. But coming back to this, I think the idea that, if I've understood you right, you say that people who are less educated are underemployed, take whatever job that they can get. They don't figure in the unemployment statistic. And therefore, we think unemployment is less severe than it really is. But the people who ought to be getting jobs are, they have graduate degrees and so on. And you find that these are people who are applying for jobs and not getting any. And these are people who probably lack the marketable skills that are required in order to get those jobs. When it comes down to that, the other thing I was reading was that when I look at developed nations and their vocational skills, those kind of skilled workforce in such countries, they seem to have like 70-80% of the workforce seem to have they seem to be having some serious levels of skill. While even in developing countries like Colombia and Mexico, etc., I find that 25% of them have such skills. While in India, that vocational training seems to be very low and only about 5% seem to have that. What do you think is the reason for it and what could be done to address that?
Well, this is, if you look at, again, the PLFS data, these statistics for India are incredibly low. The share of those who report to actually have any sort of formal vocational training is just about 4%. But I would say, from the perspective of what's happening in the labor market, let's step back and not just focus on vocational skills. I think we basically need to focus on the level of education and what are the foundational skills that people have. Because one of the issues, as you mentioned in your comments, is whether people are truly employable or not. And while on the one hand, we hear of this huge jobs crisis and people not finding jobs, what we also hear constantly from industry chambers and all chambers of commerce is that there are no skilled workers. Workers are not employable. And here there is a more fundamental problem of human capital formation, to my mind. Because if you, go back to the level of foundational skills that we are providing to our youth, those are abysmal. We have data that comes out of the ASAR surveys that tell us every year how students who are in class 5 or class 8 are not able to do the math that a class 2 child should be able to do. They're not able to read a sentence, in English that a class 2 child should be able to read. So we fall so far back in just developing basic foundational skills, which essentially provide us with the tools that we need to prepare people for the changing world of work, to actually go into a job and even learn the skills. We talk about, vocational skilling. We talk about, which are very narrowly defined areas in which they are being skilled. But the trouble is that changes in the world of work are happening at such a rapid pace. Even if I were to enroll in some vocational program today, I'm not sure whether the skills I require to perform that job will even remain the same by the time I graduate, or will the nature of that job change altogether? So what I truly need is to have the skill of adaptability, the cognitive skills, the socio-behavioral skills, which will allow me to be employable. And that's what's something which is so seriously lacking. So I won't even go as far as you're going to talk about, skilling people in certain occupations, but saying that first we need to correct the foundational skills that we are providing to students at the school level.
Absolutely, Dr. Kapoor. I was just looking back at my career. I've worked for over 3 decades in industry before I joined Takshashila. I started off doing work which was slightly related to what I studied. I went to Pilani and I did a MBA and all that. And I joined industry. I was in manufacturing. I made industrial rubber products, right? So then I went on. So that was slightly related to what I'd studied. You expect somebody who had gone to an engineering school and like business school to do that. Then I went on. But then because I had the right kind of education, or I went to the right schools, I came from a certain kind of socioeconomic privilege. As a consequence, I was able to go and acquire skills in technology, data science, and all that, and then built a career over the next 2 decades in an area in which India did very well with respect to digital and analytics and artificial intelligence and so on. But not everybody has that advantage. And like you said, not having that benefit or not having that skill or the ability to go and acquire new skills is the real thing, right? More than actually the skills themselves. Yeah. And so how do we do that? What do we do? Do we just overhaul the schools program to make sure that people focus on these kind of things? What do you recommend there?
Well, I would say basically focus on, developing what the World Bank calls the skill of adaptability, which is a combination of cognitive skills and a combination of social behavioral skills. Because again, that's one area. The social behavioral skills that human beings have will still give them some advantage over machines. And those are perhaps the last things, or perhaps the things that would not get automated. So recognizing the importance of foundational skills, focusing not just blindly on outcomes as we do in our education architecture, but the inputs, and ensuring that children acquire those skills becomes important. But of course, that requires us to rethink, because the current education system does not think in the perspective of whether the people, once they graduate, are these students going to be employable. So that link between education and the transition to the labor market needs to be bridged. And it's good that you asked this question, because again, education and labor market performance are seen in silos. That transition and how difficult or easy that transition is something that needs to be more mainstream in the policy discourse, because we need to ask the question that are these students, graduates, whoever we're churning out, are they truly employable? Because that is a big part of the jobs crisis in India.
Yeah. And in fact, one of your previous employer, when you worked at the ILO, and the ILO had some statistic that I read recently that India might have 29 million jobs might go unfilled because we have lack of skills by 2030 years. So yes, so let's come back to the subject of jobless growth that India has been having. And has it really been jobless growth? Or is it because the data that we have shows it as a jobless growth? That was my first question, and then I can go on to.
So let me first sort of explain where this idea of jobless growth comes from. There was this paper written by Professor Papola, where he basically analyzed the data between 1999, 2000, and 2011, 12. And what was said was that between this period, India witnessed very rapid growth, about 7.3% on average. But at the same time, employment grew only by 1.5%. And so when you see these numbers, what you see is that you have a very high growth of GDP, but a considerably lower growth of employment. And you obviously think that there is a disconnect between the growth of GDP and the growth of employment, which is naturally the case. And that is why this was referred to as jobless growth. And this was basically a consequence of the fact that GDP growth was being driven by sector, which did not have high employment elasticity, which were not labor intensive in nature. And therefore, you saw this disconnect between employment and GDP. So it's not something which is so related to the statistics, but it was essentially a construct of the sectoral composition of growth. But there's something that I should add to it, which in fact, one of my bosses at the ILO has written about extensively, which is important to point out in the context of this jobless growth. And he actually says that, while you look at these statistics and you find the disconnect between employment growth and GDP growth, if you in fact look at the growth of the labor force between 1999, 2000 and 2011, 12, you find the labor force and employment growth were exactly at the same number. They were both at 1.5%. Now, what is that telling you? That almost everybody who entered the labor force was able to get a job. And that's why you actually didn't see the unemployment rate to be very high. It was around about 2.9%. So the jobless growth narrative needs to be understood in this context, because what is actually happening is that, again, because people cannot afford to remain unemployed, and mostly at this point, education levels were still low. It's only in the period between 11, 12 and 17, 18, that data where we see a big jump in the education rates. We see the composition of the labor force moving toward more educated people and consequently higher open unemployment rates. In that earlier period, almost everybody was getting absorbed into the labor market. But where were they getting absorbed? They were actually getting absorbed in the unorganized or the informal sector, because they couldn't actually afford to remain unemployed. So when I understand this concept of jobless growth, to my mind, it is about the fact that there hasn't been growth of formal jobs. There hasn't been growth of productive employment opportunities. I mean, we have had employment growth per se, because the employment growth and the labor force numbers have moved together. In fact, there's another paper where this, the employment growth and the labor force growth have been looked together since 83, 84. And the addition to the labor force is exactly equal to the addition to the workforce. So, and that this is all a consequence of the problem of underemployment, which has been manifesting and brewing in the Indian economy, and it has been there forever. Unemployment has got this huge, it's become very popular in the policy discourse since 1780 only, but the problem of underemployment has been persisting for decades. In fact, There's an article which was written by Professor K. and Raj, and I think this goes back to the 50s, even before the NSS surveys, where even then he pointed to the problem of disguised unemployment in the Indian economy. So I think that, the jobless growth narrative needs to be viewed in the context of the fact that we're in a dualistic labor market where the unorganized sector essentially acts as a reservoir of surplus labor and pretty much absorbs anyone who wants to create work for themselves or do some sort of casual work.
On this note, let's take a short break and come back after that.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri meets Minu Margaret, founder and CEO of Bliss Club. They talk about how Minu began to produce pocket-enriched activewear for women. On Big Talk About Tiny Humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna explain how one can prepare their kids for emergencies. This week on the Musafir Story, Saif and Faiza speak with Akshita Bhanj-Deo, director of Belgravia Palace, an 18th century Victorian-era style palace that is now a boutique hotel in Mayurbhanj, Odisha. And on Audio Gyan, Kedar speaks to Kshitiz Anand about his Happy Horizons Trust and his community-based learning. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you might be listening to us on. And do check us out on YouTube. We're building a whole bunch of different channels. You can find them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And we're also doing a small listener survey, which we would really appreciate your help with. It helps us kind of talk to advertisers. So you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey. It'll just take a couple of minutes and it would be really helpful to us. We do appreciate this. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance and the India Water Portal. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Yeah, so you talked about the fact that underemployment is a very huge issue in it. And it's been something that's been talked about in policy circles all the time. In fact, somebody was telling me that even at the turn of the century, there was conversation when India had a much smaller population, etc. Even then, it was believed that we have way too many people in agriculture. And we need to get people out of agriculture because there's a lot of disguised unemployment and unemployment. When I look at the agricultural sector, maybe there's a good segue to look at the agricultural sector also. A significant percentage of our population of India still lives in villages. And I was reading somewhere that it's very hard for any economy to get to above $10,000 GDP without at least 65-70% of the population being urban. So this is something that I was reading about. And also maybe because agriculture by itself is less productive, generates less income, and therefore, unless you have a larger proportion of people outside of agriculture, it's going to be an issue. When I look at countries like China and I look at many other countries, they have less than 10% of their population engaged in agriculture. So what is this challenge? And is this something that we can ever hope to overcome? Or do we have to do something very different because we are where we are today?
Well, this is a very, very important question. And to my mind, this really lies at the heart of the jobs crisis, which is one of both underemployment and unemployment now in India. The fact that India has witnessed this idiosyncratic structural transformation process where we have leapfrogged the phase of manufacturing-led growth and gone straight from agriculture to service-led growth. But the trouble is that while the service-led growth, in fact, the high-end services in particular have driven very high GDP growth, they have not generated much employment. So in this period of, high growth that India witnessed between 99, 2000 and 2011-12, when we did witness a decline in agricultural employment, both in percentage and in absolute terms, what we found that either people went and worked in low-end services or they ended up in the construction sector. In fact, construction saw a doubling in its share of employment between 1999, 2011, 12 from about 5% to almost 12%. And manufacturing, the share of manufacturing remained absolutely flat. Now, I'm not saying that, the fact that there was this construction-led growth is a bad thing because it still generated employment opportunities for those who were exiting agriculture, which is very important because, like you mentioned, that for any economy to develop, you need people to exit the agricultural sector. You cannot have about 50% of your workforce being in the agricultural sector, but generating just 15 to 18% of output. What's that telling you is that it's very, very low productivity. So you need people to exit so you can have higher productivity. Unfortunately, in India, the people who were exiting this ended up in the construction sector and not in the manufacturing sector. And, while the construction sector did well for a while till 11, 12, then it ran into its own set of problems, on account of the NBFC crisis, the fact that rural wages were stagnating and most of the construction employment was actually happening in rural areas where it was more labor intensive in nature as opposed to urban areas where it's more capital intensive in nature. Also, construction cannot really drive employment growth in any economy alone because the sort of backward and forward linkages that the manufacturing sector has with all other sectors in the economy is not something that the construction sector can achieve. So, so the big failing is manufacturing, in particular labor intensive manufacturing. And, while yes, the services sector will provide opportunities, and I'm not saying that we should ignore it, but I think we can absolutely not afford to ignore the manufacturing sector. Given the skill levels of our workforce, we need more employment in manufacturing. We need a concerted effort to expand manufacturing employment. I would say that we need a very strategic vision to do this because there has to be focus on labor intensive manufacturing. I mean, you mentioned about the whole issue of elasticity. We do need to go back to sectors which are more labor intensive in nature. These sectors need a push from the government, be it things like garments, apparel, shoe manufacturing. I mean, these are sectors which, for at least for the next 5 to 10 years, we need to put our weight behind. We need to see, whatever are the bottlenecks that are hurting these industries, be it on account of our trade policy, infrastructure bottlenecks, cluster development policy, since most of the industries in this sector are very small in nature. They're also very informal in nature. I mean, whatever it takes to support labor-intensive industries and spur their growth and unshackle them is what we should be focusing on for the next 5 to 10 years, to my mind, because we need people to exit the agricultural sector. And especially the unfortunate thing that's happened is that in the 2019-20 PLFS data, what we actually saw was that for the first time, there was an increase in agricultural employment in India. So this was a sort of reversal in our structural transformation process. And while that was to a large part pandemic driven, because again, agriculture was emerging as an employer of last resort, this is something that we urgently need to course correct. Because if we don't generate employment opportunities outside the agricultural sector, these people will continue to languish in the agricultural sector. They will remain underemployed. It will be low productivity. This will have an implication on rural wages and demand for the entire domestic demand for the entire economy.
Government sector is an interesting thing that you talked about, and it's very heartening to see how Bangladesh increased its women's labor force participation rate, particularly on the back of a very vibrant garment industry. And I mean, we might have conversations, and there are instances of like poor labor practices, etc., all that. But nevertheless, I think manufacturing definitely seems to attract, large manufacturing at least seems to attract women. And also having large manufacturing units employ large numbers of people. I think in India, the formal sector by definition or the organized sector by definition has been largely capital intensive rather than labor intensive. And that's quite funny in a country which has such a large population and a young population at that. We ought to be encouraging more labor intensive industries than capital intensive industries. We have been short of capital, surplus in labor, but yet have been promoting capital intensive and less labor intensive industries. I think that's how. The second thing that happened in India was I see that, it's been the small scale industries. Many industries items were earmarked for the small scale industries. And these were typically ones which required less capital and more labor, because the definition of a small scale industry also was dependent on the amount of capital that you invested in the organization. So this led to a situation where it's labor intensive businesses grew, but only in small industries. And I also heard you speak about this the other day when you mentioned that these companies by their very nature lack economies of scale and therefore were not able to grow. My view there, which may differ from yours, is that maybe it was the labor policies of the time which made it very hard for large organizations, besides the capital intensity argument. I'm saying also the fact that having labor laws which made it very difficult for people to reduce their workforce in keeping with demand, meant that people just decided to either outsource their production to small units, which were outside the gambit of all these laws. And therefore they did whatever they did. But otherwise we could have built, if we had better labor laws, could we have built large labor intensive businesses?
So there are lots of questions in what you've just said. So I'll try to answer it sequentially. I think the first point that you made is very important. One of the ironies of India's industrial development strategy has been that despite us being a labor abundant nation, we have chosen to focus more on capital intensive industries. In fact, if you go back to the second 5-year plan, the Mahalanobis strategy of industrialization was precisely about this issue. And where they said they took this decision that, okay, we are going to focus on heavy capital goods industry, because in order to be self-reliant and not have to depend on imports for key capital goods, we should develop a heavy capital goods industry. And despite the fact that the incremental capital output ratio was considerably higher, we were a capital scarce nation. And, that thinking in our industrial policy has actually not changed very much over decades. We still see these capital intensive industries to be what, I think which Prime Minister Nehru referred to as the temples of modern India. And even at the time when the second 5-year plan came up, when there was this Mahalanobis strategy of industrialization, at the same time, there was a Bombay plan which was put up where they said that no, instead we should focus on actually wage goods industry. But, given whatever constraints at that time, we chose to focus on capital goods industry. And that's sort of been the legacy in our industrial policy, because even if you look now at schemes like PLI, which I think is very promising, actually, the selection of industries is very, very high, capital intensive in nature. So to my mind, labor intensive industries have actually not got their fair due in India's industrial policy framework, which is what I was saying previously, that I think we need to have the strategic vision of industrialization for India, and our industrial policy needs to recognize that we need to focus on these key sectors which are critical for employment generation, and not just on industries which are capital intensive in nature. What also happened in our industrial policy historically, like you mentioned, is that we had this small scale reservation policy, which was the cornerstone of our industrial policy for over 6 decades. And we ended up preserving production of certain items, which we believe were labor intensive in nature for smaller industries. So as a result of it, we didn't actually encourage small industries to grow, because they got so many benefits for remaining below a certain size threshold, and they would have to lose access to producing those items if they grew above a certain size, that we encouraged them to remain small. Now, the policy was completely done away by, I think, 2000. Process of dereservation started in 1997 and it was completed by 2005-06. And I should tell you, I have a recent paper on this where I actually analyzed the employment distribution across firms of different sizes. And in the period between 2005-06 and 2015-16, there has in fact been an improvement in the employment distribution. And we are seeing a shift in employment towards larger firms. In fact, medium and larger firms is happening. And it's happening not just in capital intensive industries, but it's also happening in labor intensive industries like apparel and textile. So that's something good which has happened. Now, to your question about labor laws, to my mind, the labor regulation argument has got far too much wages than it truly deserves. The role of labor regulations in impeding the growth of India's manufacturing sector, to my mind, is much, much more modest than the intensity of the debate suggests. And this is, for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is that amongst all the other things, labor regulation is just one factor. When you look at the entire gamut of factors that will influence investment in industry, there are factors like the size of your market, which has been an issue. There is availability of credit. There is access to infrastructure. There is your trade policy. Do you, in fact, have access to your inputs, key inputs at reasonable prices? Or, the various regulations that you need in order to do business. I don't want to get into the ease of doing business, which has now been disbanded, but, we know that there are plethora of forms, over 3,000 filings that even small and medium enterprises that have to do. So labor regulation is just one factor. And here too, I should point out that in the post-liberalization period, the point that you mentioned about firms not being able to expand simply because they don't have the flexibility to hire and fire. I think the managements have figured out various ways of circumventing these labor laws, be it through outsourcing of labor, be it through contractualization of the workforce. So even though the labor laws are perceived to be very rigid, it's just de jure rigidity, but de facto, there is a lot of flexibility in India's labor law regime. And a consequence of that, none of this is a positive thing, though, the dichotomy between the de jure rigidity and the de facto flexibility. Because what this has meant is that basically people have ended up in poorer quality employment in more precarious contracts. And of course, we need to reform labor laws to, ensure that people have decent employment. But I think what is, over and above all the other facts that I've said is that we actually haven't invested enough in our human capital, in our labor, to give them that basic level of industrial literacy, which is required to even perform labor-intensive tasks well. And that's, again, something that we have ignored historically. I think the idea that we see labor as a mere factor of production, that it's something whose cost has to be simply, squeezed. We have to push the wage bill down. I think that, you should also think that your labor is your consumer. So when you squeeze the labor share, it also has implications for your domestic demand. But more importantly, if you go back to the East Asian experience and you look at the work of people like Alice Amsden, which is perhaps not so acceptable in the mainstream, what they actually point out is that in late industrializing countries, workers actually have a very, very important role to play in that development process, because these are the people who are actually learning and adapting the technology which is coming from the advanced countries to these late industrializing countries. So they're not simply passive cogs in the wheel. So how we see labor and, commodifying it as a mere factor of production instead of thinking of it as an asset that you need to invest in, and not realizing that they do need that basic level of industrial literacy to perform these tasks well, has been a failure. It's not just labor laws, to my mind. I think we need a radical rethink on the way we look at these issues. And just to finish the last point, whether does it really matter? I think there's the case of Rajasthan that we have to see. Rajasthan made some key amendments to the labor laws. In fact, it relaxed, the Factories Act, the Industrial Disputes Act, Contract Labor Acts, all of which were seen as impediments to the growth of industry. But despite that, we've done some analysis, and so I've seen other papers as well on the subject, where at the plant level, at the factory level, we actually don't see any positive impact on employment as a consequence of relaxation of these factors. So there's a whole set of factors which will determine industrial performance in the state. And so, we shouldn't think that the labor law is going to be the cure for all the years.
No, absolutely not. I agree completely that there are multiple factors that drive employment. And labor laws is just one of them. And also looking at, I think what might have happened as I see it is if you have been promoting the organized sector to be more capital intensive and the unorganized and small scale industries to be labor intensive. The people in management of these large scale enterprises probably have not learned also how to look at labor in a different fashion, how to use them as more than just factors of production and to manage large workforces effectively, right? I think we have probably, so directly, indirectly, it might be because of many things. It may not just be the law itself. The second thing which has happened is maybe because of the organized labor having certain benefits which they ought to have, and 90% of the economy being outside of that, those who are not following the laws or flouting it or circumventing it seem to have become more competitive than those who follow the law. So then what happens that you have lots of people, like you said, businesses circumventing the law by outsourcing the work to smaller units. Then that leads to lack of economies of scale and lack of competitiveness globally, but at least temporarily you get some sort of benefits to do this. So I understand that there are many other factors, and Rajasthan is an interesting example that you gave just by throwing out all these laws and saying they don't matter, you can do whatever, go laissez-faire and see what you can do. That by itself is not going to create a market where there's none. I think that's unless
go ahead. So just to add, I want to clarify here that I'm not saying that the way the labor law architecture is at the moment is desirable. Because like you said, it's not serve the interests of industry or of workers. Because while we have given a very high degree of protection to a minuscule proportion of the workforce, in just about 2 to 3%, large swaths of the workforce have actually been left completely vulnerable because people have resorted to management practices, so they don't have to get permanent workers on board. So it serves nobody's interest.
No purpose.
But at the same time, to think of it simply along the lines of hire and fire, and simply as a factor of production, to my mind, is also wrong. And on the point of competitiveness that you're making, I think the question there of competitiveness, whether the firm will be competitive or not, what its productivity will be, will also depend on its worker productivity. So if you have a poorly educated and unhealthy worker who's being made to work for 20 hours in exploitative conditions, that's not going to translate into higher worker productivity. If you have somebody on a very precarious contract, what incentive would that worker or even the firm on the other side actually have to invest in firm-specific human capital, which will help to enhance the productivity of the firm? So while you might be able to make some profits in the short run by squeezing that wage cost, my point is essentially that, competitiveness, be at the level of the firm or at the level of economy, will not come simply by squeezing the cost of labor. It will actually come by enhancing their capabilities. And at the level of the worker, that enhancement of capabilities happens through human capital formation. So, this is just, a larger point, but I think we need to rethink how we approach this whole issue.
Absolutely.
To my mind, for example, in the labor codes, the introduction of fixed-term contracts is a very welcome development because it gives firms the flexibility to keep them on for whatever period they require. And at the same time, it gives workers some degree of security. That's a good thing to my mind. And we need to think more along these lines. There's also the Social Security Code, which says that we should try and provide social security to all workers, including those in the unorganized sector. Now, of course, that's very challenging in terms of the logistics. But these are all important things because we also need to think, how do we de-link social security from your employment status, given that most people are self-employed in India or they're casual in nature. So, my broad point is we need to rethink the whole approach towards labor laws and labor.
Absolutely. And I agree. I could agree more when you talk about looking beyond a labor as just a cost per employee problem, but looking at them more from a productivity, enhancing their skills, making them contributors to, and what do you do to increase revenue per employee rather than just cost per employee, right? And so look at it from that perspective, you might find them to become much more productive and therefore aid in making you more competitive as an enterprise. And so let's move on from that. I think there's from labor laws to a subject of, we talked a little bit about the skills that we have in India and what we need to do. But I think I wanted to know, what do you think about under these, if you look at the world, today, a lot of progress is happening in the areas of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence. These seem to be the areas in which a lot of research and progress seems to be going. This is where the investment dollars are going. If you look at where VCs are investing money, etc., they're all investing money in something like this. They're not investing money in organizations which can generate large-scale employment, right? Under these circumstances, are we too late to the game of trying to get people jobs? Is AI and automation going to make it even harder for us to do what we are seeking to do?
Definitely. There is no denying the fact that because of the rapid pace of technological change, increasing automation, the use of robotics, artificial intelligence, and all of that, employment creation is going to be a very, very challenging task. And what is also worrying is that we know from evidence across advanced countries that the first jobs which are going to go away are the ones which are routine tasks, which involve a lot of manual skills. So it's basically the people who are at the lower end of the education and the skills ladder who are going to be impacted, and that's going to lead to polarization in the job market. So, there is no denying the fact that that's happening the world over. It is going to happen in India. But in terms of whether we really missed the bus or not, I think, we don't have much control over that because it's just the way the nature of our demographic trajectory has been such that working age population will be peaking at a time when all these changes are happening in the world of work. And there's this conversation around the fourth industrial revolution. We need to see what is the best that we can do in the current scenario. And here there are basically 2 points I want to make. One is that, we should be careful about the extent to which we also overplay this. Because this conversation around automation and robotics and all is largely driven by what's happening in the developed world. It is the developed world which is determining this trajectory of technological progress. We are still very far from that frontier. Now, just because it is technologically feasible to do something in some part of the world doesn't mean that it will also be technologically feasible to do it in India. And more importantly, will it be economically feasible to adopt those kind of technologies? I mean, it could simply be because your labor cost here is still considerably cheaper. It could be because maybe the enabling environment that you need to use those technologies is not available in India, or you don't have the skilled labor, or, whatever other enabling environment that you require to use those technologies is not there. So perhaps we do have that narrow window of opportunity, to my mind, which we should aggressively exploit to create more employment. But again, this is something which is more short term. I think in the long term, this is a cause of serious issue for the global south, because the countries where these technological changes are happening and the few firms which are leading these conversations are based in the global north, which is labor scarce. What the global south needs to think about, and I think India should be a leader in this conversation, perhaps in the G20, is how do we bend the arc of technology to suit our needs? How do we bend the arc of technology so that these technological changes are actually more labor friendly and not just labor saving? How do we use them to enhance labor productivity? There's a very interesting example that Darren Asimoglu actually gives. It's a very obvious example, but when I read it, I was like, this makes perfect sense. He talks about the Green Revolution and how during the Green Revolution, there were all these, it was funded by Western organizations, but the high yielding variety of seeds were particularly suited to developing countries, and they had to. So technology was being used. It was being funded by the Western countries, but it was the intellectual leadership of developing countries that was actually, figuring out how do we use this technology to enhance agricultural yields in developing countries. So I think we need to, take the lead in this and say that, okay, this technology is there. Now, how do we adapt it in the context of our nations to meet our needs, be it in terms of education, be it in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of enhancing our labor productivity and making it more labor friendly? I mean, why should all technology simply be driven because it is labor saving? If it doesn't suit the conversation, it doesn't suit the landscape of the global south, I mean, we need to think about it. And I think it's something that probably doesn't get enough attention because the debate is driven exogenously by what's happening in the advanced world.
I agree that a lot's happening in the advanced world, and we might be panicking a little too early. But at the same time, I think it's also, I'd say, organizations looking at artificial intelligence and automation as not just means of labor saving, but also as means of being able to produce goods and services of higher quality or more efficiently, so that it is beneficial to the consumer in the way that they perceive. So I think that's also an important reason for doing it. And people look at it from that perspective. But the unintended consequence of that could be some loss of jobs in certain sectors. But considering that we don't have a very large manufacturing sector, maybe it'll take us a little while more to be sort of impacted by it very adversely.
Well, I mean, if you look at even the data that we have for the formal sector, it's very clear from there that the capital labor ratio has been rising across the board. It's been rising both across labor and capital intensive industries. So, that's something, but even there is some scope of the relatively more labor intensive industries to perform better and create employment, which goes back to the question of whether, you need the strategic vision of industrialization. I mean, just to give you an example, this data that comes out of the International Federation of Robotics. The last I looked at it, and this is pre-pandemic data, in India, the use of robotics was largely concentrated in the use of welding activities in the automobile sector. There was no other sector it was actually used so rampantly. The usage was very high, and the reason for it was because actually there was a serious lack of skilled workers. skilled welders in India. So that might be one factor which is, also driving this automation. The fact that you don't have the skilled workers, and in certain things where you require to do very high precision work, you need to resort to automation. But on the automation side, I mean, there's one point of caution here that, this whole argument about machines will take away all our jobs. I think that's very scary from a macroeconomic perspective, because what that means is that essentially the share of labor in your national income would fall so dramatically, and the share of labor income of those who own capital in machines and the robots will rise so significantly that I don't know where aggregate demand in the economy is going to come from. So the question of, just macroeconomically, where will the demand come from if the jobs go away is a serious problem. So, at some point there will have to be, I mean, that's the context in which universal income is discussed in the West, that you need to provide a universal basic income, because if this were to happen, where would people get income from? But I think in India, we're still far from that conversation.
Absolutely. I think we need to get our per capita GDP to a significant size before we can talk about redistribution in a meaningful manner. Otherwise, we're just doing small things and calling it redistribution, right? Which I think,
we definitely don't. To my mind, I think having universal, we don't have the fiscal space to do.
We don't have the
universal
fiscal
basic
means to
income.
do it.
But yes, we still need some sort of redistribution happening, and we do need to spend more.
And that comes to the last question for the discussion today, is about the gig economy. And you talk a lot about, while there's a shortage of jobs, we should focus on quality of jobs and not just blindly pursue quality and quantity and assume that the problem's going away, right? So what do you think about the fact that over the last decade, over 54% of the new jobs created have largely been gig jobs? And so is that the future? Is it here to stay? How do you sort of see other countries addressing it, and what should India do?
So, well, on that statistic, it's very confusing because we actually don't have any data on gig work. And, the surveys actually don't have this category of gig work. Gig workers are lumped into the category of self-employed workers. So how we measure gig workers is it's an issue which we're grappling with the world over. It's not something which is unique to India. But yes, I think, the question about quality versus quantity is very important. Now, of course, on the one side, you say that we're now in such a desperate situation that give people whatever jobs they want. And so it doesn't matter what the quality of that job is. But there has to be some focus on the quality of employment. Now, look, for example, what happened during the pandemic. Precisely because so many people were in precarious employment, they lost their jobs immediately. And they had been in low-paying jobs, which didn't actually give them the buffer to have accumulated savings so that they could tide themselves over the period of the lockdown when they lost their employment. They didn't have access to social security. The whole crisis of migrant labor that happened. I think that was a wake-up call. That look at the quality of employment that we're generating for our people, that it leaves them so vulnerable that when a crisis happens, they are just not, there is no safety net which is out there for them. The PDS was a lifesaver, Narega was a lifesaver, but that's pretty much all we had. So I do think that there has to be a conversation around good jobs, decent work. This is a difficult conversation to have, though, because who pays for these good jobs? If I say a good job is one that gives me access to at least a social security benefit, most of employment in India is actually in small and medium enterprises. Now, the way they struggle, I think, it's unreasonable to expect them that every worker who's hired gets all these social security benefits. Then again, there's a quarter of the employed are actually in casual work. So it's a non-standard employer-employee arrangement. They have multiple employers. How do you make sure that they get social security through their employment status? So, this is a difficult question. I think the state has a role to play in, because remember that having a good job is a positive externality for society. Look at the sort of crisis that happened with the railway jobs. These things could potentially lead to unrest and be a negative externality for society. So I think the state does have a role to play in creating these good jobs. Financially is what I'm alluding to. It's a difficult question, but I think they've started enrolling unorganized workers. So I hope that something constructive comes out of that in terms of designing programs that actually give them social security and it goes beyond enrollment. To your question of gig work, I think, the gig work is really a new form of informality. I mean, if you look at it very broadly, anyone who's doing casual work or what we call a dihadi worker in Hindi, and basically he's a gig worker. He has no fixed employer. He does an odd job one day here, one day there. And, the gig workers, they're just going and working in different places, but it's through their platform. So, the idea, I mean, people need to be provided social security regardless of what their employment status is. My concern with gig work is that very often these workers who are doing gig work are doing the same thing that a regular salaried worker would be doing, but they're just being labeled as gig workers because firms are trying to avoid paying the costs that are associated with having these workers on their payrolls directly. And that, I think, is worrying. And so that is why I think it's important for India to actually have a clear definition of gig work. And again, this is a conversation happening globally. There's the AB5 law in California. And even in UK, the court passed a judgment saying what gig workers were and whether the Uber drivers were in fact, employees or they were gig workers. So given that this is becoming more and more rampant, I think we need to have a clear definition of what a gig work is. If a person is a regular worker, then he should be treated as such. And if he's truly independent, then he goes into the category of self-employed work. But it shouldn't be my worry with gig work is that there are a lot of new entrants into the workforce, young workers who are doing their first job. They're stepping into the labor market doing gig work. And that has led to a lot of volatile earnings. They have no defined career path. There is less job satisfaction. They don't know where it's going to lead to them. There's very little social security. So having your first job in the labor market as such a job could have potentially negative effects on your career later, or perhaps a scarring effect. And I think that is something which is worrying because a lot of young people are being compelled to do this gig work because the nature of the labor market is moving towards this, and there are not too many people being hired in, regular or permanent jobs.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this. And I think this has been it's sad when you look at some of the numbers. But at the same time, I think lots is being done. I think we need a lot of conversation on this topic and lots of new ideas it's not an easy problem to solve. It's not something that one or two people in government can fix. It's something that all of us in civil society need to be engaged in and be talking about. So that's what. The second thing, I think the most important, which you started off with, was the importance of having access to the right data with the right frequency. And with very little lag, which I think we're trying to do. And that's important in order for us to understand the magnitude of this problem and come up with fixes that are meaningful. Thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor, for your time.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor, and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.
We face 100 dilemmas every day while raising our children and nurturing our families. Why not let science help us make informed decisions to solve our dilemmas? Hi, I'm Devi Shobha.
And I'm Meghna. We host Big Talk About Tiny Humans, where we will help you unpack challenges around parenting and your child's development.
And more importantly, we will equip you with research-backed strategies that you can readily act on.
Tune in to our podcast every Wednesday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or your favorite podcast platforms.